When my neighbor's secret came to light, a shocking revelation. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the world seems to slow down just enough to give you a moment of peace. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow across my neighborhood, and I was out on my porch, sipping my coffee and enjoying the stillness. My neighbor, Mr. Anderson, was out too, tending to his garden like he did every weekend. I had lived next door to him for years, and he had always been a quiet, reserved man, someone who kept to himself but was polite when we did speak. He was in his late 60s, with a neat beard and glasses that made him look like the kind of person you'd find lost in a book. He was the kind of neighbor you didn't think twice about, the type you saw occasionally when you passed by but never really got to know. To be honest, I never gave him much thought until that morning. I don't know why, but there was something about him that day that seemed off. As I sat on my porch, I noticed that he was moving in a way that seemed a little too hurried, like he was trying to hide something. Normally, he took his time with his plants, adjusting the soil, making sure everything was in its place, but today he was acting strangely, glancing over his shoulder, quick movements, like he was trying to avoid being seen. I couldn't help but watch him for a few minutes, trying to figure out what was going on. He wasn't even looking at his garden anymore. He was more focused on something near the back of his house, a small shed that I had never really paid attention to before. It was tucked away at the corner of his property, hidden by overgrown bushes, but that morning, it stood out like a shadow in the light. He seemed to be watching it, waiting for something, and that's when I saw it, a car pull up to his driveway. I wasn't expecting visitors. The car was black, sleek, and unfamiliar. It parked at the end of his driveway, and out stepped a woman. She was tall, with dark hair, and she walked towards the back of his house with purpose. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I saw Mr. Anderson's reaction. His eyes went wide when he saw her. He immediately stood up straight and looked around nervously, like he didn't want anyone to see her. I should have looked away, pretended I didn't notice, but something about the situation felt wrong. The woman knocked on the back door of the shed, and after a few seconds, Mr. Anderson opened it just enough to let her inside. They spoke briefly, and then the door shut behind them. I could still see Mr. Anderson's figure through a small crack in the shed's window. His posture was tense, almost as if he was trying to keep something hidden from the outside world. I had never seen him act this way, and it made me feel uneasy. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence, but something inside me told me that this wasn't normal. After about an hour, the woman left. She didn't say anything to Mr. Anderson as she walked back to her car. She just got in, drove off, and disappeared down the road. Mr. Anderson stayed in the shed for a while longer, then finally came out and began cleaning up his garden as if nothing had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was going on in that shed? Why did he act so paranoid when the woman showed up? I decided to let it go for the day, but my curiosity gnawed at me. The next few days were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I saw Mr. Anderson in his garden, I noticed how he would glance over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to show up again. It was strange, like he was waiting for a call, or maybe trying to avoid being seen. One evening, I was walking my dog around the neighborhood when I noticed something strange. The shed door was slightly ajar. The overgrown bushes had been trimmed back, and I could clearly see inside. Without thinking, I walked closer, my heart pounding in my chest. I was taking a huge risk. Mr. Anderson would never forgive me if he caught me snooping, but I couldn't help it. My feet moved on their own, and I found myself standing in front of the shed, looking inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a shed. There was a table in the center, covered in what looked like maps, papers, and old photographs. They were spread out in a haphazard way, as if someone had been working on them in a rush. There were other objects too, strange tools I didn't recognize, and a locked chest sitting in the corner. But the most disturbing thing was the wall behind the table. There were large pieces of paper pinned to it, all marked with dates, names, and locations. Some of the names were crossed out, but others were highlighted in bright red, like someone was keeping track of people. I stepped back in shock, my heart racing. What was this? Was Mr. Anderson involved in something illegal? Something dangerous? I couldn't make sense of it. I had to know more, but I knew I couldn't go any further without risking being caught. I quickly left the area, my mind racing. I spent the rest of the night trying to piece together what I had seen, but nothing made sense. The next day, I decided to do some research. I went online, trying to dig up anything I could about Mr. Anderson. His name was common enough that I didn't find anything immediately, but I did stumble across something that caught my eye, an old news article from about 20 years ago. It was about a missing person case. A young woman had vanished without a trace, and the investigation had gone cold after several months. The woman's name was on one of the papers I had seen pinned to the shed's wall. I froze. Could it be? Was it possible that Mr. Anderson had something to do with the disappearance? I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence seemed to be pointing in that direction. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had found. I was watching Mr. Anderson more closely now, noticing every small detail about his behavior. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was fear. He was afraid of something, and whatever it was, it had to do with those papers in the shed. I knew I had to confront him, but I didn't know how to even begin. Then, one night, everything changed. I was walking my dog when I saw a shadow move across Mr. Anderson's living room window. The lights were off, but there was enough moonlight for me to see that someone was in his house. My heart raced as I realized that I wasn't the only one watching him. I quickly rushed home, grabbed my phone, and called the police. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't just stand by anymore. By the time the officers arrived, the shadow had vanished. Mr. Anderson was nowhere to be found, and the house was eerily quiet. The police searched the premises but found no signs of a break-in or anything unusual. They questioned me, but I couldn't provide much information other than what I had seen in the shed. They left, telling me there was nothing they could do unless I had more concrete evidence. The next morning, I woke up to a note on my doorstep. It was from Mr. Anderson. "I know you've been watching me," it read. "You don't understand what's at stake, but you'll learn soon enough. Leave it alone, or you'll regret it." My hands shook as I read the words. What had I gotten myself into? What was the secret Mr. Anderson was hiding, and why did he think I needed to stay away? I don't know what to do now. I feel like I'm on the edge of something much bigger than I ever expected. Something darker. And I don't know if I can walk away from it now. When I learned to embrace my uniqueness, a personal story. When I learned to embrace my uniqueness, it wasn't in a triumphant moment of clarity or a well-lit scene in a movie. No, it came slowly, reluctantly, and in layers, like a fog lifting from a field in the early morning light. It was a process marked by uncomfortable, awkward moments that were as humbling as they were revealing. Growing up, I had always felt like the odd one out. While others seemed to move through life with an effortless sense of belonging, I stumbled, trying to mold myself into a shape that just didn't fit. At school, I was the quiet kid who preferred books over sports, who found comfort in stories and imagination rather than in crowds and popularity. I was never bullied, not exactly, but I could feel the subtle isolation, the whispered comments and sidelong glances, the sense that I didn't quite belong. My family loved me, sure, but even there I felt like a bit of an outsider, the creative in a family of pragmatists, the one whose interests and quirks didn't quite line up with their practical ambitions and tidy plans for the future. It wasn't until I left for college that the loneliness of it all started to sink in. Surrounded by new faces, I tried harder than ever to blend in, to be someone who could slip into conversations without a second thought, to say the right things, to wear the right clothes, to adopt the easy laughter and casual confidence I saw in others. I even joined clubs and groups that I thought would make me feel normal, hoping that if I surrounded myself with the right people, I'd somehow absorb their comfort with themselves. But no matter how hard I tried, I still felt like I was faking it, like I was wearing a mask that everyone could see through. Then, in my second year, I met Sophie. She was in one of my literature classes, the kind of person who radiated a quiet confidence that seemed to draw people in without her even trying. She was quirky, unapologetically so, wearing vintage clothes and talking passionately about things most people would dismiss. She didn't just stand out, she stood tall in her uniqueness, unbothered by what anyone thought. One day, we ended up working together on a project, and over time, I found myself opening up to her in a way I hadn't with anyone else. I confessed my struggles, my fears of being different, and my constant feeling of not fitting in. She listened without judgment, her eyes warm and understanding, and then she said something that would stay with me forever: "You're not meant to fit in. You're meant to stand out." At first, I brushed off her words as something people say to make others feel better. But as we spent more time together, I began to notice how Sophie didn't try to hide her quirks, she leaned into them. If she had a strange idea, she shared it. If she had an unusual perspective, she owned it. Watching her, I realized that what made her so magnetic wasn't that she was trying to stand out. She simply didn't hide who she was, and that authenticity made her shine. Her words echoed in my mind for weeks, slowly breaking down the walls of self-doubt I'd spent years building. I started to experiment, testing out small bits of myself that I'd kept hidden for so long. Instead of stifling my love for poetry, I began sharing my favorite lines with friends, even if it felt strange. I started wearing clothes that felt true to me, not just what I thought would help me blend in. I allowed myself to express opinions that I'd usually keep to myself out of fear of seeming too intense or different. At first, it was terrifying. I worried about the stares, the questions, the inevitable judgment. But to my surprise, people started responding positively, not in the way I'd expected, but with genuine interest and curiosity. They wanted to know more, to hear my thoughts, to see the world through my lens. I found myself forming connections with people who valued me for who I truly was, not for the person I'd been pretending to be. There was one moment, though, that truly cemented this newfound acceptance of myself. Our class was holding a small poetry reading, an informal event where students could share their own work or pieces they admired. Sophie urged me to read something I'd written, but the very idea terrified me. The thought of putting my deepest, most personal words out there for others to see felt like baring my soul. But she wouldn't let it go, and finally, I relented. My hands were shaking as I took the small stage, my voice wavering as I began to read. I'd chosen a piece I'd written late one night, a poem about feeling lost, about searching for belonging in a world that seemed determined to ignore me. As I spoke, I expected the usual polite smiles and nods, the lukewarm response of people who didn't quite understand. But as I finished and looked up, I saw faces filled with understanding, with empathy, and something even deeper, a shared vulnerability. When I sat back down, Sophie leaned over, squeezing my hand with a smile that said everything words couldn't. That night, people came up to me, sharing their own stories of feeling out of place, of hiding parts of themselves in a desperate attempt to fit in. It was then that I realized how many of us walk through life wearing masks, hiding the very things that make us unique, that make us human. Over the next few months, I embraced this realization. I stopped worrying about what others thought, stopped trying to mold myself into someone I wasn't. I found myself attracting people who valued authenticity, who were drawn to my unique perspective, my quirks, my passions. It wasn't about being liked by everyone, it was about finding those who saw me and accepted me for who I was. And with each passing day, I felt freer, lighter, more at peace with myself. Embracing my uniqueness didn't mean I became some unshakable pillar of self-confidence overnight. There were still days of doubt, moments when I'd fall back into old habits, but I'd remember Sophie's words, her unwavering belief in being true to oneself. And I'd remind myself that I was enough, that my value wasn't determined by anyone else's approval. Looking back now, I realize how much that journey shaped me, how embracing my uniqueness transformed not just how others saw me, but how I saw myself. I learned to love the parts of me that I'd once tried so hard to hide, the parts that made me who I was. And in doing so, I found a sense of belonging, not in the approval of others, but in the quiet confidence of knowing I was being true to myself. Embracing my uniqueness wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that I'm still on, one that continues to teach me the value of authenticity, of self-acceptance, and of the quiet strength that comes from standing tall in who you are, unafraid and unapologetic. My friend stole my baby name, now she wants me to change mine. I had always dreamed of having a daughter and naming her something special, something unique that held deep meaning. When my best friend Sarah and I first discussed baby names years ago, we both casually mentioned our favorites, and I revealed mine, Aveline, a name I had loved since childhood. It felt enchanting, a blend of beauty and strength, just like I hoped my future daughter would be. Fast forward a few years, and I found out I was pregnant. The news was exhilarating, and I couldn't wait to share it with everyone, especially Sarah. I called her immediately, ecstatic, telling her about my pregnancy and the name I had chosen. Sarah sounded genuinely happy for me, and we spent hours discussing baby preparations, my nursery ideas, and how we would support each other through motherhood. Then, just a few months later, I received a text from Sarah. She had just given birth to a beautiful baby girl. My heart soared for her, but when I saw the name she had chosen, my stomach dropped. It was Aveline. I couldn't believe it. I felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. I was devastated. How could she take my baby name? I had told her my choice in confidence, and now she had gone and used it for her own child. It felt like a betrayal, and I struggled to process my emotions. I was happy for Sarah but felt anger bubbling beneath the surface. How could she do this to me? When I confronted her about it, she laughed it off, insisting it was a coincidence. It's such a beautiful name, how could I resist? She said, brushing aside my hurt feelings. I tried to remain composed, but inside, I was seething. I couldn't let her get away with this. I spent nights crying into my pillow, wondering if I should still name my daughter Aveline or come up with something else entirely. A part of me felt like I should abandon the name to avoid conflict, but another part felt like I was giving in to Sarah's inconsideration. I eventually decided I would keep the name Aveline because it was special to me, regardless of her decision. The weeks passed, and my due date approached. I was excited yet nervous, thinking about how things would unfold with Sarah after my daughter was born. Would she resent me for keeping the name? Would it ruin our friendship? These thoughts haunted me, but I tried to focus on my pregnancy and preparing for the big day. Then, the day finally came. I gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl, and when they handed her to me, I felt a rush of love I had never known before. As I held her, I whispered, "Welcome to the world, Aveline." Just a few hours later, Sarah arrived at the hospital, her baby in her arms, beaming with pride. The moment she saw my daughter's name on the board, her smile faltered. "Oh, so you really went with Aveline?" she said, her tone a mix of surprise and disapproval. "I thought we could talk about this before you decided." I felt my heart race. "Talk about what?" "I've been telling you since I was pregnant that Aveline was my choice," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She rolled her eyes. "But you know I wanted to keep the name for my daughter. I thought we could share it." "Share it? You can't just take a name and expect me to give it up because you used it first," I snapped, feeling the anger boiling over. Sarah's eyes narrowed, and I could see the tension building between us. "It's not fair to me. Why can't you just change your mind?" "It's not too late," she demanded, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could she have the audacity to ask me to change my daughter's name after she had taken it from me? "You can't be serious right now," I said, my voice trembling with disbelief. "You took my name. You can't just decide I should change it to make you comfortable." She huffed and crossed her arms, refusing to back down. "It'll just cause drama between our families if we both have daughters with the same name. Think about it." I shook my head, feeling the tears prick at my eyes. "I can't believe you would ask me to do this. Aveline is my baby's name, and I'm not changing it for you." She scoffed, "You're being selfish. This isn't just about you, it's about our friendship." My heart sank. This wasn't about friendship, it was about Sarah's desire to feel like she had the right to dictate my choices. I turned away from her, shaking with anger and frustration. "Get out," I said, my voice firm. "You need to leave." She paused, looking hurt, and for a moment, I felt guilty. But that guilt was quickly overshadowed by my resolve. I wasn't going to let her walk all over me anymore. After that day, things got tense. I returned home with Aveline, and Sarah sent me countless texts, pleading with me to reconsider, to be reasonable. I ignored her. I was too hurt to engage. My daughter was my priority, and I needed to focus on her, not Sarah's drama. Days turned into weeks, and I settled into motherhood. But the tension with Sarah lingered like a storm cloud overhead. I kept my distance, choosing not to engage with her on social media or answer her texts. The drama escalated when she decided to throw a birthday party for her daughter. I was hesitant to attend, but I knew I needed to be civil, for the sake of our friendship. When I arrived, the atmosphere was charged with unspoken tension. Sarah greeted me with a forced smile, but I could feel the animosity simmering beneath the surface. As the party progressed, I watched as she introduced her daughter, who was also named Aveline, to the guests, and the awkwardness was palpable. Guests were confused and whispered among themselves about the shared name, and I felt my heart pound in my chest. I was furious. Later in the day, while the kids played, I overheard Sarah talking to another friend. "I can't believe she didn't change the name. It's so inconsiderate," she said, and I felt my blood boil. I couldn't let this go on. I approached her, my heart racing. "You need to stop talking about me behind my back, Sarah. If you have a problem with my choice, say it to my face," I said, my voice steady despite my nerves. Her eyes widened, surprise flashing across her face. "I wasn't talking about you," she exclaimed, but I could see the guilt in her expression. "You have no right to demand I change my daughter's name after you took it from me," I continued, my voice rising. "You are ruining our friendship over something that should be a joyful occasion." "It's just a name," she shouted back, and I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. "It's not just a name. It's my daughter's identity. You can't just dismiss that." "You're being dramatic," she said dismissively, but I could see the cracks forming in her facade. The guests around us had gone quiet, sensing the growing tension. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. "You have to understand, this isn't just about names. It's about respect. I respected your choice to name your child, but you didn't respect mine. And that hurts more than anything," I said, my voice softening. Her expression shifted, and I could see the realization hitting her. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought we could share it. I didn't think it would come to this," she admitted, her voice trembling. I could feel the anger dissipating as I looked at her, my best friend who had turned into a rival overnight. "I want us to be okay, but I can't compromise on this. Aveline is my daughter, and I want her to feel proud of her name," I replied, my heart aching at the distance that had grown between us. Sarah took a step back, her eyes downcast. "I'm sorry. I didn't think it through," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I messed up." It felt like a small victory, but it was a step toward healing. "I think we need some space to figure this out," I suggested, my voice calm. "I hope you can understand that." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I do. I'm sorry." As the party continued, the atmosphere began to shift. I saw Sarah interacting with other guests, but the tension was still there, lingering in the air. Over the following weeks, I focused on Aveline and healing from the hurt of our friendship. Sarah sent me messages, trying to reach out and apologize, but I felt it was best to take time apart. Then, one day, I received a letter in the mail from her. It was heartfelt, filled with apologies and an understanding of the pain she caused. She expressed her wish to meet and talk things through, and I felt a glimmer of hope. We agreed to meet at a local park, our favorite spot. As I approached, I saw her sitting on a bench, looking anxious. I took a seat beside her, and we both sighed simultaneously. "I've missed you," she said softly, and I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me. "I've missed us too," I replied, my heart ached for the friendship we once had. We spent hours talking, opening up about our feelings and I never used to believe in emotions. To me, they were burdens, clutter in my already chaotic head. I had perfected the art of detachment, thinking it would make me invincible. I scoffed at the idea that vulnerability could ever lead to strength, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you're least prepared. It started one rainy afternoon when I received a voicemail from my estranged father. You see, we hadn't spoken in years, a fact I wore like armor, believing it shielded me from pain. But when I heard his voice cracking through my phone like a fragile egg, all the walls I had built came tumbling down. He was calling from a hospital bed, a place I once thought I'd never be connected to in any way, asking for forgiveness. I felt a mixture of anger and pity, a toxic cocktail I didn't know how to handle. I thought about hanging up, about burying the feelings that rose up inside me like a tidal wave threatening to swallow me whole. Instead, I gripped the phone tighter, listening to each word that felt like knives. "I'm sorry I failed you," he said, his voice quaking. Something deep inside me stirred, something I had shoved down for so long that it felt foreign. I swallowed hard, trapped between the urge to scream and the urge to cry. I chose silence. Days passed, and I became increasingly obsessed with the voicemail, playing it over and over again like it was a cursed artifact, trying to decode what my response should be, what my life could look like if I stopped pretending emotions didn't exist. I imagined what it would be like to forgive him, to let go of the hurt I had clutched like a lifeline. But what if I opened that door? I could feel it slipping away, my carefully constructed defenses, and it terrified me in ways I couldn't articulate. That Saturday, I went for a drive, hoping maybe the road would guide me. I turned off my phone, pulled the windows down, and let the cold wind slap against my face, but nothing prepared me for what awaited me at the edge of a secluded forest road. An old woman appeared out of nowhere, standing beneath a gnarled tree with branches that looked like skeletal fingers reaching towards the sky. She wore a tattered shawl, and the rain trickled down her face like tears. I pressed the brake, stopping inches away from her. As I rolled down the window, she pointed a bony finger at me. "You carry heaviness, child. They will come for you." It was so absurd that I chuckled nervously, ready to dismiss her completely. But her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that froze the laughter in my throat. "You must embrace it, you know. Face your fears or remain a prisoner of your own heart," she said, her voice shaking. I felt a chill run down my spine. She spoke as if she knew about the voicemail, about everything I hadn't let myself feel. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, fading into the drizzling twilight as if she were a figment of my imagination. I sat there in stunned silence, her words looping in my mind like a broken record. I drove home with a knot in my stomach, feeling distinctly haunted. The next day, determined to confront my emotions, I decided to visit my father. It felt surreal when I approached the sterile hospital room, but there was a nagging optimism gnawing at me. He looked frail, smaller than I remembered, and my heart softened despite all the armor I had wrapped around it. "I'm sorry," I stuttered as I walked in, unable to disguise my wavering voice. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening as if he was seeing me for the first time in years. "You don't have to be," he replied, but I could see the tears pooling in his eyes. I didn't want to move, afraid that the act of reaching out might shatter this fragile moment. But then I remembered the woman in the woods, her icy talon-like finger pointing at me, imploring me to embrace the fear rather than run from it. I stepped closer. "No, I need to say this. I've been angry for so long. I thought forgetting would make it easier, but it didn't. It only made it worse." Suddenly, all that pent-up emotion exploded like a shaken bottle of soda. I collapsed into sobs I didn't know were trapped inside me, drowning in the pain of all those lost years. To my surprise, my father didn't recoil. He reached out, frail fingers tapping my hand gently, and that simple act felt cathartic. We began exchanging stories, speaking of hurt, loss, regret, and, strangely, love. With each shared confession, I felt bricks fall from the wall I had built, one by one. There was laughter, amidst the tears. I learned that emotions could connect us, create bridges over the chasms time had carved in our relationship. Hours later, I left the hospital feeling lighter, cradling the newfound truth like a fragile artifact. The old woman hadn't just been right, she had been a messenger, though I didn't know how she knew. I returned to that forest road often, seeking her, needing guidance as I grappled with this evolution of my emotional landscape. Though I never ran into her again, I felt her presence within me, guiding me toward uncomfortable confrontations but also unlocking hidden joys. I learned to embrace all emotions, the heart-wrenching heartbreak, the soul-tingling joy, the awkward vulnerability. Each one, I discovered, told a story worth hearing. I slowly started to weave these emotions into my everyday life, and for the first time in years, I felt alive, at one with myself and others. I found comfort in family, friendship, and love. I even started writing again, pouring my truths onto paper, crafting tales born from the legitimacy of my experiences. I learned that embracing emotions wasn't about vulnerability or fear, it was a reclamation of the self. I still remember that old lady, her eerie words ingrained in my psyche, reminding me every day that we must face what haunts us. Life isn't meant to be lived armored, it's meant to be felt deeply, passionately. Who knew that in confronting the raw edges of my life, I'd find a rich tapestry of existence waiting on the other side of fear? Now, instead of avoiding my emotions, I wade through them, allowing their depths to color my world, no longer afraid of their weight, but empowered by their truth. When I helped a child overcome their fear, I didn't realize that my attempt at kindness would lead to a nightmarish turn of events that would haunt me forever. It started innocently enough one late autumn afternoon while I was volunteering at the community center, an overcast day with the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. I noticed a small boy named Danny sitting alone in the corner, hunched over and staring at the floor. His classmates were running around, playing games and laughing, but Danny remained an island unto himself, his wide, anxious eyes betraying a deeper dread. Concerned, I approached him and asked, "Hey, buddy, what's wrong?" Why aren't you playing with the others? He looked up, his small voice barely above a whisper as he replied, I can't. They told me that the basement is haunted. At first, I thought he was just being silly. Kids will say anything to get out of doing something they don't want to do, but the look on his face told me he really believed it. Intrigued, I knelt down to his level, placing my hand gently on his shoulder. Is that so? What's in the basement? He glanced down nervously and said, there are shadows. And sounds. I heard someone crying. My heart sank a little at that. I decided then and there that I was going to help him overcome this fear. In that moment, I became the fearless adult to his frightened child, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I could turn this around for him. I smiled and said, you know what? I'll go down there with you. We can check it out together. There's nothing to be afraid of when you have a friend with you. His eyes widened in surprise and, after a moment of hesitation, he nodded slowly. A daring plan formed in my mind, and it didn't take long for us to gather a flashlight and head down the creaky steps that led to the basement. The air grew colder the lower we went, and though I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, I was determined to push forward for Danny. We reached the bottom, and I flicked on the flashlight, illuminating the dusty, cobweb-filled room. Boxes were piled haphazardly, and the shadows seemed to dance at the edges of the beam. See? I said, trying to sound upbeat. Nothing scary here, just some old junk. Danny remained glued to my side, his face white as a sheet, but he didn't say anything more. Just as I was about to turn back and reassure him further, we heard it, an unmistakable sound, like a soft, heartbreaking sob coming from the far corner of the basement. My heart raced as goosebumps blossomed on my skin. I glanced at Danny, and I could see that whatever resolve he had was rapidly crumbling. My initial instinct was to turn and run, but I couldn't let fear take control. Let's go check it out together, I said, though the words felt like lead in my mouth. I took a cautious step toward the source of the sound, Danny hesitating for only a moment before following me. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, but I walked forward, flashlight beam shaking slightly as we drew near. The sobs grew louder, more distinct. Hello? I called, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the terror building within me. Silence fell as we neared the corner, only to be met with nothing. But the sound continued, deep and mournful. I swung the flashlight around, and there, half hidden behind a stack of boxes, I saw something that sent chills racing down my spine. It looked like a small, hunched figure, shrouded in shadows. I felt Danny grip my arm tightly as he whispered, we should go back. Ignoring the growing dread, I approached it cautiously, hoping it was just an old mannequin or someone's forgotten costume. Are you okay? I asked, trying to reach out, but before I could take another step, the figure turned its head slowly. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into a pair of hollow, lifeless eyes, the face resembling something human but twisted in anguish. Help me. It rasped, voice barely above a whisper. Panic coursed through me, and I could feel Danny shaking beside me. We need to leave. He pleaded, but something inexplicable held me in place. The figure's mouth twisted into a horrifying smile, and the sobs turned into manic laughter. Just then, the light flickered, and I felt an overwhelming chill sweep through the room, pulling at my very soul. I grabbed Danny, my mind racing. We're leaving, I yelled, turning to bolt for the stairs. We stumbled over the boxes and raced up the steps, heart pounding wildly. As we reached the top, slamming the door shut behind us, heavy silence enveloped us, but I could feel something still lurking in the dark. Danny was in tears, and I sank down beside him, hugging him tightly. It's okay. You're safe, I promised, though I didn't believe my own words. I waited until the tremors subsided before glancing at the door, convinced that whatever we had seen hadn't followed us. I took him to find some of the other kids, hoping to bring back some sense of normalcy. But as we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the basement held something far darker than just shadows and sounds. Over the next few days, Danny often sought me out, and with time, he began to share more about what he had seen in the basement. His words haunted me, it said it was lonely. Despite my attempts to comfort him, I felt a creeping dread settle into my bones as the days turned to weeks. The laughter from that figure echoed in my ears at night, drowning out every thought. I started to lose sleep, consumed by fear that the basement would somehow become a part of my life. Then one night, as I lay tossing and turning, I heard something, soft crying echoing from the basement door. My heart dropped, realizing Danny's worst fear was coming for me. I gathered the courage to get up, feeling compelled to face whatever it was that haunted that place. Cautiously, I opened the basement door, heart pounding in my chest. The crying stopped when the door creaked open, and there was an unsettling silence that filled the space between us. As I stepped inside, the darkness seemed to embrace me, and for a moment, I felt completely lost. But then, beyond the boxes, I saw it, just a shadow, yet somehow it felt more solid, more real. The figure was returning, its visage just as twisted as before, now no longer distant but approaching with a harrowing grin. "Help me," it whispered once again. I turned and stumbled back, heart racing as panic flooded my system, and I fled the basement, slamming the door behind me. Bursting into tears, I realized that I had crossed a line, and whatever was in that basement was no longer content to stay hidden in the dark. It had begun to haunt my every waking moment, lurking in the corners of my mind, whispering that it needed help. I never told Danny what happened after that day. I couldn't risk bringing that haunting presence into his life. In an effort to escape, I stopped volunteering, avoiding the community center altogether as the reality of what I had unleashed slowly settled in. Weeks turned to months, and my nights became plagued by nightmares of that figure, its hollow eyes gnawing at my sanity. One evening, unable to bear the weight of it any longer, I visited a local library, searching for any tales of hauntings or the occult that could explain what I had encountered. The shelves were filled with stories of lost souls, forgotten places, how each spirit needed something to find peace. The realization struck me like a bolt of lightning: I had left that child in the basement. Whatever connection I forged, my brief attempt to be brave had inadvertently given birth to something dark, lost, and forever in pain, and now it wanted my help. Even after months, the sounds persisted, crying in the dark, shadows creeping across my walls. I found myself back at the community center, standing before the basement door once more, caught in a cycle of dread. I was sure the spirit of that twisted figure would haunt me for the rest of my life, forever hungry for something I hadn't dared to understand. But one thing remained clear: I didn't just help a child overcome their fear, I awakened something far more sinister. The basement was no longer just a place for kids to be afraid of, it had become a realm of nightmares, where shadows whispered secrets to those brave enough to listen. I had opened a door that could never be closed, and I feared that soon, very soon, it would reach out beyond those walls and ensnare the innocent hearts of children once more. How I overcame my fear of heights, an adventure. I've always had a deep, gnawing fear of heights. It wasn't just discomfort, either, it was a paralyzing, gut-wrenching dread that kept me glued to the ground, miles away from anything higher than a second-floor balcony. I couldn't even look down from a tall building without my stomach twisting, my palms sweating, and my heart hammering so loudly I could feel it in my throat. The mere thought of being on the edge, looking down at the endless drop below, was enough to make me feel faint. It was irrational, I knew that, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. Over the years, I'd learned to live with it. I avoided anything that could trigger it, always finding excuses to skip activities like rock climbing or even roller coasters. My friends knew about it, my family knew about it, and I had no intention of ever confronting it head-on. That all changed one summer when my best friend, Alex, convinced me to join him on a hiking trip in the mountains. I hadn't expected him to choose a trail with sheer cliffs and precarious ledges. He'd assured me it would be a straightforward hike, one that stayed within the forest's thick cover, far from the edges that made my heart race. But as we trekked higher, I noticed the trees thinning, the air growing cooler, and the path narrowing until it became clear that we'd soon be crossing open, exposed terrain with dizzying views of the valley below. I wanted to turn back, every fiber of my being was screaming at me to find a reason to go back down, to wait at the campsite for Alex to finish on his own. But something held me back. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, his expression mixed with encouragement and a challenge he didn't even have to say out loud. He knew I was terrified, yet he believed I could do this. I told myself I'd give it a try, that I'd go as far as I could and stop if it got to be too much. The first real test came when we reached a narrow path carved into the side of the mountain, with nothing but a metal railing between us and a steep drop hundreds of feet below. My legs felt weak just looking at it, and my vision blurred as I gripped the railing, afraid to move any further. Alex was calm, guiding me to breathe slowly, in and out, grounding me with his voice. He showed me how to focus on each step, not on the void beside us. I kept my gaze on the rocky ground, refusing to look down, trying to ignore the knowledge that the only thing separating me from that empty space was a thin metal bar that felt flimsy and insufficient. Step by step, I made it across, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. The adrenaline was overwhelming, but as I reached the end of the section, something inside me shifted. It was as if a tiny spark of confidence ignited in my chest, a small flicker of pride that I hadn't given in to the fear. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I could handle a little more. Alex seemed to sense this, too, and he urged me onward, his own excitement contagious. We continued up the trail, each step taking us closer to the summit, and each time I felt the fear creeping back in, I'd focus on his voice, on the steady rhythm of my breathing, reminding myself that I'd made it this far and I could keep going. As we climbed higher, the views became more expansive, and I couldn't help but glance over at the breathtaking panorama that stretched out before us. The valleys, the rivers winding through the green forest, the distant peaks shrouded in mist, it was all so beautiful, yet so terrifying. But I couldn't bring myself to look away. There was a strange sense of awe mingling with the fear, a feeling I'd never experienced before. It was as if the height itself was pulling me out of my comfort zone, forcing me to confront the part of myself that had always held me back. We finally reached a plateau near the summit, where the cliff dropped sharply away into open space. Alex suggested we sit down for a while to catch our breath and take in the view. My instinct was to stay far from the edge, to keep my back pressed against the solid rock behind me, but a stronger part of me felt compelled to sit closer, to inch toward the edge and see the world spread out beneath me. I lowered myself onto the rock, legs stretched out in front of me, and looked down. My heart pounded, my hands shook, but I forced myself to keep looking, to let the fear wash over me without pulling back. I focused on the details, the texture of the rock beneath me, the way the wind felt on my face, the patterns of trees and rivers far below. And as I sat there, something incredible happened. The fear was still there, but it didn't feel as overpowering. It was as if I'd found a way to coexist with it, to acknowledge it without letting it control me. In that moment, I felt a sense of freedom I'd never experienced before, a sense of strength and resilience I didn't know I had. I realized that the fear of heights was a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. I could choose to face it, to live alongside it, and in doing so, I could finally see the world from a new perspective, one that had always been out of reach. Alex noticed the change in my expression, the calmness that had replaced the panic, and he gave me a knowing smile. "See? You did it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. We sat there in silence for a while, just taking it all in, the mountains, the sky, the sheer vastness of the world around us. As we made our way back down the trail, I felt like a different person, someone who had faced one of their greatest fears and come out stronger on the other side. It wasn't a perfect victory, and I knew that my fear of heights wouldn't disappear overnight. But I had proven to myself that I could confront it, that I could push past the limits I'd imposed on myself. When I faced rejection and surprised myself, I always told myself that I was prepared for rejection, that it was just a part of life. But when the moment came, it hit me like a cold wave of dread, leaving me breathless. It all started at the end of last summer. I was living in my cramped studio apartment, drowning in the noise of the traffic below while my roommate was away. I had just finished my final year of college and was about to apply for my dream job. I had worked tirelessly for the past 4 years, and in my mind, if I put together the right cover letter and resume, there was no way I could fail. As the weeks rolled on, I tirelessly tailored my application, hoping it would grab their attention. But on the day I hit send, that familiar knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach. It took nearly a month before I got the email. I was out at the grocery store when I saw it flash across my phone. I didn't even bother to finish checking out. I rushed home, heart racing. When I got to my apartment, I opened the email, and that's when it happened. "We regret to inform you." Followed by a series of corporate fluff about how they appreciated my interest but had chosen another candidate. I prepared myself for disappointment. I'm not someone who crumbles at rejection. But this felt different. It tore through me. I tossed my phone aside, my stomach in knots, and threw myself onto the couch. I found myself staring at the wall, questioning everything, struggling to breathe. Moments felt like hours as I spiraled deeper into self-doubt. At that moment, all I could think about was how I had invested so much time and energy into something so painfully out of reach. It was like I'd opened a door in my mind to a room filled with all my failures, and I couldn't look away. But then something inside flickered, a rebellious urge, a need to prove that I could rise again. I grabbed a pen and paper, and for the first time, I began to write down my feelings, capturing the hurt, the anger, and ultimately, the determination I felt. I started writing a short story, pouring myself into it, transferring all my fear and disappointment onto the page, like casting a spell to ward off the gloom that threatened to swallow me whole. Day by day, the pages filled up with my pains and triumphs, blending reality with fantasy, creating a world entirely separate from my own. I was lost in the thrill of creation, so engrossed in crafting my story that I lost track of time. It became an incredible escape from the despair that had settled in my heart, my tale morphing into something more potent than mere therapy. This was empowerment. The months slipped by, and with each passing week, I polished and honed my story until it felt complete. It was a surreal experience, like I had resurrected a piece of myself I didn't even know was missing. I decided to share it on a writing platform where other aspiring writers gathered. Heart racing, I posted my work and prepared for immediate feedback. The next couple of weeks were filled with comments, and to my shock, it gained traction. As the days passed, the likes and positive reviews began to skyrocket, winning the hearts of readers who resonated with the themes of rejection and resilience. Comments flooded in, telling me my story connected with them on a level they hadn't anticipated. I couldn't believe the warmth of encouragement pouring through my screen. It felt surreal. People I had never met were telling me how much my words meant to them and how they, too, had faced rejection and fought their way back. And as more readers found my story, something amazing happened. I connected with a community of writers and readers who uplifted each other, supporting one another's artistic journeys. This thriving network motivated me to brush up my skills further. I even began collaborating with other authors and shared workshops to help aspiring writers hone their craft. I felt like a phoenix reborn from the ashes of rejection, and it was exhilarating. Months later, I was surprised to receive a message from a small indie publishing house interested in turning my short story into a full novel. They had discovered my writing through the platform where I had posted. They wanted to know if I was interested in expanding my piece into something larger. It took every ounce of restraint not to scream in disbelief. I found that irony delicious. Rejection had birthed a harvest of creativity that had led to this opportunity. I spent months crafting my manuscript, channeling every ounce of personal struggle and triumph into my writing, and when it was finally published, I felt a surge of accomplishment. I had done it. The cover of my book bore my name, and readers who had once only expressed their support now actually held something of mine in their hands. I chuckled when I thought back to how dismal the future had appeared after receiving that rejection letter. It was a subtle reminder that sometimes, we need to face our shadows, to let them haunt us just a little before we can seize our light and resist the urge to hide. And with that, I had learned that rejection was not a dead-end road but rather a detour, a winding path leading to unforeseen opportunities. I hadn't just faced rejection, I had transformed it, reshaping that pain into fuel for my passion. So if you're ever in a place where the weight of rejection feels unbearable, remember, sometimes, it's only when we confront our sorrows head-on that we surprise ourselves, and perhaps, even find the strength to rewrite our stories.
They never listen. They never believe. But I'll keep trying, because that's all I can do. That's all I've ever been able to do. My heart raced as I watched the townsfolk gaze over my shoulder, laughing at the darkness creeping in, unaware that they were on borrowed time. It started when I was 8. The whispers in the walls became impossible to ignore one fateful night when I followed them down into the damp, unlit basement of my grandparents' house, a relic of long-forgotten memories and old secrets. They reached for me with their slithering voices, urgent and pleading, but those echoes morphed into terrifying screams as I stumbled across a crudely buried chest. I opened it, igniting the air with a sickly sweet stench of rot. Inside lay old photographs of children who once played in our town. Their eyes darkened and lifeless in a way that gripped my spine as I realized they weren't simply memories, they were warnings, relics of the town's buried past. I tried to tell my parents, tried to tell others, but they dismissed me, chided me for my overactive imagination, and, worse yet, my peers mocked me for my fears which only deepened my resolve. Week after week, as I spiraled deeper into obsession, the sounds grew louder, relentless. They called to me, promising power if I'd only set them free. I remember the night they first took one of us, a girl from my class, her laughter now a distant memory. Everyone else shrugged it off as just another disappearance, but I knew better. I pressed harder, seeking the truth, only to be met with scorn each time. So I began to investigate alone, combing through every library's dusty shelf, piecing together lore of our town's twisted history, and soon I came to a chilling realization: whatever sinister force dwelled beneath us had claimed the souls of children every generation, feeding off them to preserve its own existence. The restless whispers grew into a violent cacophony, begging for a connection, and that's when I made the most horrific mistake. I drew a simple sigil in my notebook, a forgotten child's drawing, twisted and wrong, and when I unwittingly chanted the words, the air turned electric, and I felt something tear through the fabric of reality. It was like opening a door to a nightmare that had been waiting for me, and the thing on the other side was hungry. I felt its icy breath on my neck, pulling me towards a hypnotic shadow that flickered at the edges of my vision. The next morning, the world felt darker. The sun barely broke through the clouds, and the townsfolk went about their routines, oblivious to the creeping dread that has etched itself into the very bones of the town. Every night after that, I heard tapping, gentle at first, like a child trying to get my attention, but soon escalating into frantic pounding, demanding I listen. They told me to run, to hide, to warn everyone, yet every word was met with more disbelief. "You shouldn't let your imagination run wild," the adults said as they glanced away in pity. I could see the glimmers of their fear lurking behind their laughter, but they didn't understand that laughter leaves you vulnerable. As days turned into weeks, those voices grew stronger, more distinct. I could almost see their faces, twisted, terrified, and begging for redemption. The townsfolk started disappearing one by one. The police opened a missing persons case, but they didn't listen to the whispers that echoed in the wind, and every time I tried to explain, they just shook their heads, blind to the truth so vividly clear to me. I felt it then, a deep, gnawing rage welling up inside me. They'd rather live in blissful ignorance, dismissing what was right in front of them. So I devised a plan. That night, as the moon hung overhead, a watchful eye, I set up candles in a makeshift circle, whispering the names of those who had vanished to the empty air, my breath mingling with the rising smoke. I pleaded for them to answer, for anyone to recognize the horror lurking beneath our feet. And just as I thought it was hopeless, the shadows coalesced into something sentient, tendrils of darkness reaching for me, caressing my skin with an understanding that terrified and exhilarated me. I saw faces emerge in the murky abyss, the lost children, their mouths moving in a silent scream. I had finally made contact, but it was too late. The door had swung wide open, revealing the boundless hunger behind it. Visions flooded my mind, horrors that should never be seen, families ripped apart, laughter turning into screams echoing into nothingness. I staggered back, the unholy knowledge weighing heavily on me, threatened to consume me. It was then I finally understood: the power was never meant to be mine, and the cost of silencing those wandering spirits was too great. In my desperate need for belief, I had awakened something monstrous. Just as I turned to run, I felt icy fingers clutch my wrist, dragging me back into the shadows. I screamed, an inhuman sound that echoed through empty streets, hoping someone would listen, hoping someone would pull me back from the brink. But the wind carried my cries away, drowned by the laughter of oblivion. Now, as I write this, trapped beyond the veil, I hope my voice can still reach you through this tale, pleading for you to heed the warnings etched in whispers. They never listen. They never believe. But if you hear my words, please, for the love of the lost, don't let the darkness in. It sits there, patient and waiting, and trust me, it needs no invitation.
When I discovered the healing power of nature, I was desperate. It was the summer after my dad passed away, and I felt like a ghost, just haunting the halls of our old house, surrounded by memories that felt too heavy to bear. I had always loved the outdoors as a kid, but after his death, I found it hard to connect with anything, including the comforting embrace of trees or the calming sounds of rustling leaves. My friends suggested I go on a hike, to get away from the suffocating silence of my home, so I reluctantly agreed and found myself driving to a nearby national forest. It wasn't the extravagant getaway I was hoping for, it was more of a distraction, something to fill the void inside of me. When I arrived, I felt a tightness in my chest, as if nature itself was pulling me back, but I pushed onward anyway. My knees knocked as I ambled onto a narrow trail that snaked between towering pines. I took a deep breath, drawing in the crisp air, and tried to convince myself it would help. As the sun filtered through the branches, casting shimmering patches of light on the ground, I felt slightly lighter, but the sadness was still there, like an unwanted shadow following me. I decided to keep walking, to push my limits, to find a spot where I could sit and think, somewhere far from the world that had become increasingly unbearable to me. I wandered off the main path, following the sound of a bubbling stream, and found a secluded glade bursting with wildflowers and shaded by a massive oak tree. It was breathtaking. I sunk down onto the carpet of green grass, my hands gripping the earth beneath me, as if hoping it would ground me. At that moment, I was enveloped in silence, save for the soft murmur of the stream and the gentle rustle of the leaves above. Just when I thought it was finally peaceful, I heard something that made my heart race, a low, rhythmic humming resonating from within the trees. I froze in place, unsure of what I was hearing. It was as if the forest itself was singing, vibrating with a melody that pulled at my heartstrings. Curiosity outweighed my fear, and I decided to investigate. I followed the sound, moving cautiously through the underbrush until I came upon an ancient-looking stone circle nestled between two giant boulders. The humming was louder now, almost tangible, and I felt an overwhelming draw to it, like it wanted me to step inside. It was bizarre, and part of me screamed to turn back, to flee, but another part urged me to go deeper into whatever this was. As I entered the circle, the humming intensified, wrapping around me like a warm blanket. Suddenly, the forest seemed to come alive, the flowers glowed brighter, the trees swayed in a dance, and the very air shimmered with energy. For the first time since my father's death, I felt something shift inside me. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, inhaling the earthy scent of the soil mixed with the fresh fragrance of pine needles. The world faded away, and in that moment, it was just me and the forest, intertwining in a mystical embrace. After what felt like either moments or hours, the singing stopped as abruptly as it had started, and I opened my eyes, expecting to feel disheartened that the magic had vanished. Instead, I was overwhelmed with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I left the stone circle with a renewed spirit, a strange warmth filling me, a sense that perhaps I could heal. But over the next few days, I became obsessed. I returned to that spot day after day, each time feeling the melody call to me, filling the void that my father's absence had carved into my heart. I made it a ritual, to sit in that circle and connect with something greater than myself. And I wasn't alone there, the forest seemed to come alive in my presence. I began to notice things, the way the sunlight danced on the water, the intricate patterns in the bark of the trees, and how the wind whispered secrets through the grass. I documented everything in a journal I had brought along, writing down my experiences and the peculiar sense of well-being I was starting to feel. However, with each visit, I noticed unsettling changes. The forest felt different each time, darker somehow, as if it thrived on my grief and despair. The comforting hum that once enveloped me now began to feel menacing, and shadows flickered just beyond the corners of my vision. One evening, as twilight descended upon the forest, I lingered too long inside the stone circle. The beauty I had come to cherish morphed into something unrecognizable. The trees clawed at the sky like tortured hands, and the once vibrant flowers dripped with an eerie darkness. Suddenly, as I prepared to leave, I noticed that I wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, ethereal, fragmented shapes that resembled what I could only assume were lost souls, trapped in the liminal space between our world and whatever came next. Panic coursed through me, and I stumbled back, trying to escape, but the forest roots wrapped around my feet, pulling me deeper into its grasp. Their whispers grew louder, pleading, demanding. They wanted me to stay, to join them. I'm not sure if it was my grief still lingering or something more sinister, but I felt a pull towards them, as if they were a reminder of the deep sorrow I had buried. But then I remembered my father. I fought against the darkness. In a moment of clarity, I recalled the happiness he had brought to my life, the warmth of his laughter, the moments we shared outside watching the stars. Using that memory as my anchor, I broke free from the suffocating grip of the forest, sprinting away from the stone circle and back onto the main trail. The shadows shrieked behind me, and the forest thundered with a rage that echoed against the mountains. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. I barely looked back as I sped away, leaving the enchanted nightmare behind. I knew then that nature's healing was real, but it wasn't without its price. The power that had once pulled me in had twisted and turned, revealing a darker side that thrived on pain and despair. I came to understand that grief can't simply be erased in silence or solitude. Sometimes, it must be faced, not buried under a shroud of false serenity. As I drove away, I felt an unfamiliar feeling growing within, a mixture of sorrow yet gratefulness, knowing I couldn't escape my feelings but could learn to embrace them. Healing doesn't always mean forgetting. It means understanding the weight of loss while finding light through the darkness. There's a fine line in nature, sometimes healer, sometimes harbinger. And now, every time I feel overwhelmed by my grief, I choose to walk the balance, knowing that maybe the true healing power of nature lies in its ability to show us our own strength to face our shadows.